what I've observed around the world is that where there is more democracy and more actual true citizen participation in decision making, the environment is better. The environment is protected more. The wildlife are given a little more space in the decision making. And so that's what we need now is we need citizen action, and we need to really push, especially with all the development happening downtown, that the needs of the river as habitat need a boost right now.
Welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington. Downtown Santa Cruz was built along the lower San Lorenzo River, and it was a huge part of daily life for decades. However, following the devastating Christmas flood of 1955, levees were built that walled off the San Lorenzo River from downtown Santa Cruz, and for years it was maintained by its builders, the Army Corps of Engineers. In 2020, the care of the levee was turned over to the city of Santa Cruz, and FEMA set in motion a stringent federal accreditation process for the 2.2 miles of levee, which the city must finalize this July of 2023. And it is a critical deadline. Without it, homeowners and businesses in the floodplain will not be able to secure flood insurance. Well, the Department of Public Works is now embarking on the last stage of the accreditation work, which involves removing plants along the outer banks of the levee and reducing ground squirrel populations whose burrows are assessed as critically threatening the structure itself. But the levee is not just a protective structure to move water away from buildings, nor is the river primarily for the benefit of human beings. In the eyes of many, it is a wildlife refuge, which reflects the history of this river and its estuary as being a source of life itself for many beings, human and non-human, for thousands of years. Environmental groups are concerned that the urgency for accreditation and the speed at which this huge project must be undertaken will threaten sensitive environmental restoration efforts, decades in the making and involving thousands of hours of volunteer labor. All moments in time are like tips of an iceberg with history stretching back over decades, centuries, and even millennia. And this accreditation process is one of these moments. Our show today will present some of the history of the levee, context for the accreditation process, and a vision for how to proceed that can achieve the delicate balance between the needs of a modern city, its inhabitants, as well as the needs of wildlife that call the river home. The voices included in this show are citizen stewards and influential environmental advocates, all of whom have shaped the life of the San Lorenzo River in highly beneficial ways. Our first community voice is that of Bruce Van Allen, conservationist and former mayor of the city of Santa Cruz, here speaking in a Zoom meeting held January 18th and convened by citizen steward Barbara Riverwoman and attended by numerous environmental stakeholders seeking to enhance and protect the health of the San Lorenzo River ecosystem, as well as that of the region as a whole. In this segment, Bruce Van Allen offers a fascinating glimpse into the history of the levee.
The first thing that I want to emphasize is that the way that needs to be asserted right now, the way of looking at the river is as a wildlife refuge. And the reason I say that is because that's what tends to get neglected. That's what we need citizen action for, because the other aspects of the river, like that it's a flood hazard and that it's in that we built a town in its floodplain, those are things that government has to deal with, so they will. But the habitat stuff is still on the optional list as far as government and most political action, so we have to keep pushing for it. So that's why I describe the river as a wildlife refuge. And the two things about that, there's two sides of that word refuge. One is that right now the river is one of the few places left in our urbanized area where wildlife can take refuge. That is, they can get away from the cars and the people to some extent. There's more vegetation, there's the water, and so on. The other side of it, though, is that I want our city and our county and our state to designate the river as it flows its last 2.5 miles downtown as a wildlife refuge within the levee system. It's in an urbanized floodplain, so there's no way around that, but we should be regarding that as a treasure to be protected. So it's a refuge that animals take refuge in it, and it's also something that humans need to designate as a wildlife refuge in order to protect that further. So 41 years ago, in 1982, there had been a series much worse than what we just experienced of major rainstorms, an El Nino year. And after 2 or 3 weeks of heavy flow in the river, heavy rainfall, on January 4th, I actually was staying at a friend's house in Ben Lomond. I tried to drive back into town. Highway 9 was almost impassable. The river was very high, and a report came in fact, that there was a problem with the Soquel Avenue Bridge. And I went out there with a public works guy, and sure enough, there was a fresh crack in the asphalt. You could see it because the old cracks had grass grown in them, but the new crack was brand new fresh. And I'm out there going, stomping on it, going, hey, this looks like it's coming loose. And about 2 hours later, it went straight down. Not my fault, but what happened was that sand and sediment, because of the high amount of water flowing, it loosened up that sand, and one of those massive concrete piers that would support the Soquel Bridge just sank almost straight down. And for many years afterwards, you could actually see the top of it. It looked like the bottom of a boot sticking up about 2 feet out of the sediment. And now it's continued to sink down. Every time there's a major storm, it sinks a little further. But what was interesting about that flow was, even though we didn't have a flood here, although Felton flooded, there was the massive landslide at Love Creek that killed people. We didn't flood. And that was contrary to what the Corps of Engineers specifications for the flood control project had said was going to happen. The amount of water flowing should have flooded. And this is where Gary Griggs is the hero of the story in many ways, because he was a hydrology professor at UCSC. He's kind of moved on, but he's still around. He and his grad students had been monitoring the sediment that builds up in the river. And this is one of the things about this watershed, is that it's highly erodible soil. It used to be a seabed up there, and now it's, deposited of sand and sandstone and stuff like that, and it erodes really easily. So there's a huge sediment load that comes down. Well, Gary Griggs put an article in the Sentinel just a couple days ago that has a very good history of what the Corps of Engineers did in order to accommodate real estate development in the downtown floodplain, to create more space for more development downtown, because that's what the city leadership wanted at the time. This is the late 50s, early 60s. They couldn't give the river enough space to contain the flood flows, so they had to raise the banks. And amazingly to me, and this is because they were oriented toward East Coast streams with different soils and different flow seasons and so on, they excavated the bed of the river 8 feet below its kind of natural bed, thinking that would provide the space for the high flows. Well, the problem is all that sediment load coming down from the watershed, which is endless, ceaseless, very quickly filled in that below bed containment idea. But the city had signed off and agreed to maintain the channel, and that meant they were supposed to go out and dredge all that sediment every year back down to the 8 foot below. And that almost immediately proved to be infeasible. Too expensive. It would have meant something on the order of 5,000 dump trucks every summer traveling from along the river somewhere to dump that sand, like on some beach somewhere, and tremendously damaging to any habitat value left out there, because basically they're just bulldozing and digging everything up, and we are not allowed to have any vegetation inside the levees. And if you see the original pictures of the river from above, the aerial photos, you see an utterly barren white levee on both sides of the river, no vegetation at all. But what happened was, when Gary and his grad students went back to look at where they had been monitoring that sediment, they do this very clever thing. They dig a pothole straight down, several feet down, and they fill it with crumbled brick. And then after the storm is over, they come back and dig it up, and they can tell how much the bed was washed out by how deep they have to go before they find that column of crushed brick. And so they dug down and they didn't find anything. And what that told them was that high flows of the river had, during the high flows, scoured out a huge amount of that sediment out to the ocean, creating a huge sandbar out by the mouth. In the process, it created more flood carrying capacity for itself. And that's why we didn't have a flood that year. And then, of course, when the water slows down, it doesn't have as much energy. It can't carry the sediment, so it fills in again. And so for years, no one had actually realized what was happening out there, that during the high flows, it makes more room for itself and then fills it in again. And so what Gary published a paper based on that in 82 or maybe 83 by that point. That got the attention of the Corps of Engineers. And they came out here and they were like excited to meet Gary. And so we said, oh, come on out, let's get you here and start working on them. And so Gary's study and help in Congress from Leon Panetta at the time, Sam Farr, who was in the state legislature, and a bunch of us, and a lot of citizen action, we convinced them that what we needed was a different approach to flood protection. And the idea was to count that scouring effect and to see if we count that in, which had never been done before by the Corps of Engineers, would that actually give us the ability to not have to dredge every year? And then secondly, to allow vegetation to return with the tremendous gain in habitat value that would bring.
In case you have just joined us, you are tuned in to KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM. This is Talk of the Bay, and I'm Christine Barrington. You are listening to the voice of Bruce Van Allen, conservationist, former Santa Cruz mayor, and powerful advocate for the San Lorenzo River ecosystem. He is sharing the history of the levee and the enormous efforts put into enacting environmental protections for the San Lorenzo River habitat and bringing it into greater integration with the city of Santa Cruz. Let's get back to the show.
We did a bunch of analysis. We hired the best hydrologists in the world, Phil Williams and Associates from San Francisco. And we basically convinced the techie guys in Tennessee at the Corps of Engineers that we were right. And they convinced the policy people higher up in the Corps of Engineers. And the Santa Cruz part of this was anchored by me as chair of the task force, and Joe Hall, who was in the city planning department. And Joe, very conservative guy. I mean, he's a Democrat, but he's very conservative compared to me, at least. And we had an interesting relationship. But one of the things about him was that he had stayed in the Army Reserves after Vietnam and was a very high-ranking officer, like a lieutenant colonel or something like that. And he would go back and do his reserve duty in Washington, and he would just saunter over to the Corps of Engineers office and pull rank on them, and which he could do. They had to listen to him, and he would lecture them about what we were trying to accomplish in Santa Cruz. So so it was like he and I, we both said, okay, we're both kind of by any means necessary here. You use your thing, your connections and your military status, and I'll use my activism. And what we did is we got the Corps to agree to that. And that led to the first really kind of new plan for the river, which was the San Lorenzo River Design Concept Plan. And that was adopted by the city in '89. And that expressed three goals, which were formally adopted by the city: protect from flooding, integrate the city into the integrate the river system into the surrounding city so it's an asset instead of an eyesore and a back alley and a problem, and restore habitat. Now, at that time, restore habitat was that phrase, that idea, restoration, habitat restoration or ecological restoration, had become very contentious. And we had to deal with that and Rachel O'Malley, who was on a later task force, helped us with this because that's her kind of field, is that restoration ecology is kind of a myth. It's kind of an illusion. That is, we have done so much damage that the idea that we can just go out there and either A, leave it alone, or B, actually take measures like putting vegetation back and stuff like that. We're not really restoring the original ecology. We've messed with it too much. But what we clarified for ourselves is that we can enhance habitat and make it better for wildlife. And that's really what we're about here in the San Lorenzo River. Because it's an urbanized floodplain, habitat enhancement is our goal. And that sounds like kind of a letdown from restoration, but restoration was an illusion. Now, in the really long run, downtown Santa Cruz is get flooded out of the floodplain, and in a couple thousand years, maybe this area will be allowed to restore itself without so much human, messing around with it. But that's a whole different question, and it'll be a different ecology from what it was before. So not really restoring in the same sense. So we're about habitat enhancement here. So this river design concept plan said, here is a concept, not an actual, here's where to dig and here's where to put things, but conceptual plan. And that got approved, and that led to some further work and negotiations with the Corps of Engineers. It took a really long time, and it took connections in Congress and just all kinds of stuff to push it along. But we did finally get to where the Corps and the Congress agreed that with some relatively minor reconstruction of the levee and reconstruction of the bridges, which during high flows become dams in effect, catching logs and stuff like that, which we've seen several times. That if we raised the levees a little bit, allowed that scour effect to be able to both be counted, but also that we would make sure that it's going to keep working, change the bridges, that if we did that, we could allow the vegetation to come back within some certain parameters. And so in the late 90s, the funding finally arrived, the plans were set, and fortunately, we had the city council majority of Chris and Keith and Tim Fitzmaurice and Catherine Byers, and they were able to be in charge when that process got going. During a period there were very important, and Rachel was on the task force that worked on this, Rachel O'Malley, that came up with the plan for how to actually do it. And it was both the physical engineering of how to rebuild the levees, but also because we had managed to get habitat into a much more prominent view for everybody, there was a massive botanical survey and a report and recommendations for how to restore native species and remove the non-natives. And that really is what provides the framework for the work that Jane and the Coastal Watershed Council are doing now with vegetation.
You are tuned in to KSQD Santa Cruz, 90.7 FM. This is Talk of the Bay, and I'm Christine Barrington. You are listening to the voice of Bruce Van Allen, conservationist, former Santa Cruz mayor, and powerful advocate for the San Lorenzo River ecosystem. We will be back with more about the FEMA San Lorenzo Levee accreditation process and how it might impact existing environmental enhancement efforts on the ground. Coming up next is Lori Egan, Executive Director of the Coastal Watershed Council.
Spend your Monday night at the Opera on KSQD Santa Cruz. You'll hear the world's greatest singers tell some of the world's most powerful, romantic, funny, and unforgettable stories, all set to the most glorious music ever composed. It's all about drama and being a diva. Monday night at the Opera, 7 to 10 p.m. on KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM.
Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington, and today's show is focusing on the San Lorenzo River Levee and the potential impacts of stringent FEMA accreditation requirements that could impact longstanding environmental enhancement efforts that have been years in the making. My next guest is Lori Egan, Executive Director for the Coastal Watershed Council. Well, Lori, thank you so much for joining me on Talk of the Bay. Could we start with having you introduce yourself and what it is you do at the Coastal Watershed Council?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Lori Egan. I'm the Executive Director at the Coastal Watershed Council. So I oversee all of our programs, work closely with our partners to really make sure that we are realizing this vision that we have of a thriving urban riverfront right in the heart of our downtown, where we believe Santa Cruzans can spend time in nature in their daily lives and connect to this amazing natural resource.
Wow, that's actually something to be really excited about. And one of the reasons I'm thrilled to have you on is the Coastal Watershed Council is one of the entities I think that is wanting to integrate the river better with the residents, actually all of us, the people, the critters, the plants, to be better integrated. So can you give a brief history of the Coastal Watershed Council?
Absolutely. And that integration piece that you just mentioned is so important, that this is not a river that is separate from us. People are not separate from nature, but rather we rely on the San Lorenzo River every day, and we impact it every day too through our actions. So, the Coastal Watershed Council was really founded around this idea of people connecting to their creeks and streams. Specifically, we formed in 1995, starting with volunteer water quality monitoring and looking at the water quality of those creeks and streams draining to the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and the role that we all play in keeping that water clean or impacting it negatively. And so through education, through our volunteer programs, we got hundreds of folks involved. And over time, we continue to expand that base, to think about our youth and youth education in the classroom, on field trips and after school programs, and also how water and habitat and the rest of the riparian ecosystem interact as well. So today we are focused solely on the San Lorenzo River. We actually really focus on the part of the river that flows through the city of Santa Cruz because there is such opportunity there where we haven't yet as a community really re-embraced our river like we used to in Santa Cruz's history. And so today we bring that volunteer effort and engagement to not only talk about the clean water and healthy habitat components, but also, this as a social space and a place you can take your kids to walk and just, get on their scooters after school and, really spend that time in nature that we know provides us with so much.
Wow, that's very powerful to hear. And I noticed reading on your website that there was a mention of how like the levee has disconnected people from the river. And I can say that that's my experience. I sort of see the river and I know it's there. I do not have a living connection to the river. And so I love this vision, and it's a long range vision. And before we get into talking about the levee project, I want to ask, what are some of the accomplishments of the Coastal Watershed Council? You guys have been working since 1995. You have experts, you have scientists, you have community members involved. Let's uplift some of the accomplishments of this wonderful nonprofit.
Yeah, I love that question because so often really we talk about the challenges and what's next and what we're sinking our teeth into, and to spend a moment really celebrating our work to date is so important. So I think around the San Lorenzo River specifically, I mean, there's a couple of things I'll highlight. Overall, as a community, I do see us talking about the river more, and each of us individually really, seeing it in each other's social media feeds or paying attention to this space. And that's very different from when I started at Coastal Watershed Council 10 years ago, where people, sort of question, oh, maybe I'd been to the river. Oh, that's our river. Oh, I didn't know that was our drinking water source. So there's this ethos that's beginning to change in our community. And that's really exciting. And then along the way, when we've looked at some of the water quality improvements that we can make for our river, we worked very closely with partners at the city of Santa Cruz, the county, Surfrider Foundation, and others to look at some of the sources of bacteria that were impacting our waterways and some of the controllable sources. Where can we, make an impact in stopping some of these sources from coming into our watershed and our river? So one of those sources was a lot of homes in Santa Cruz have older infrastructure. And some of these pipes that connect our sewer systems to our homes were made out of clay and some of these other materials that can break over time. So we worked with the city and local realtors to actually create a point of sale ordinance. So when a home is sold, those pipes need to be inspected to make sure that we're not having those major failures and having one of those, controllable sources of bacteria impacted. And, that's kind of one of our wonkier wins along the way, but one that I'm really excited about as it shows from that history, from the water quality monitoring itself to the action and policy that we're able to implement, the difference that we can have on clean water.
I just want to take a moment to say that you are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz. This is Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington, and my guest is Lori Egan, Executive Director of the Coastal Watershed Council, and she is sharing some of its accomplishments.
Another piece I'll mention more on the sort of social side of how we interact with the river in everyday life is our river right now and the levee along it. If you're out there, you'll notice all the buildings face away from the river. You're standing on the levee or the Riverwalk path, and you look towards downtown Santa Cruz and you might see the back of a building. But when the city went through a process to actually update its downtown plan, we were able to successfully advocate that when buildings are built along Front Street and these places along the river, that they're actually required to incorporate the river into their design and the Riverwalk into their design. So when we start to see development, which is likely to happen in the next few years as these plans are moving forward, you'll be able to one day walk on the Riverwalk path and then step right into a cafe or a restaurant or a place to enjoy time with friends and family while looking over this beautiful river that we have.
Wow, I'm so moved because I looked at the plans, the upcoming plans, the vision for how they're going to be building up along the river in the urban center. And I noticed these pathways and better integration with the river. And I thought, wow, if somebody's got some vision, this is phenomenal. I can't help but notice there are very few places in Santa Cruz to sit and enjoy the water. There's some restaurants on like the wharfs to enjoy the ocean. This is really a lost opportunity because water has a numinous life-giving quality. Just looking at it changes our state of being. So I just want to express my gratitude. That's a big win.
Yeah. And humbly, I will say that is with many, many, many partners doing this work. Whenever we are embarking on one of these projects, it is never the Coastal Watershed Council on our own. So I do always have to give credit to all those partners along the way that support these efforts. And we couldn't do it without them and without the city of Santa Cruz and others. I know you've been talking to Jane and Barbara as well about these questions around the FEMA accreditation process. So everyone, I will say, from members of the community to government, that involvement is so important.
And what I love about you bringing this in is really this theme of collaboration of different entities, citizen groups, environmental groups, and governmental entities finding ways to come together. I really like to celebrate solutions and solutions thinking. I like to emphasize it in my interviews. It's the only way we're really going to solve things is looking for opportunities and ways to come together and to celebrate our collective achievements. I really appreciate you bringing that in. And so let's get to the levee question. The city of Santa Cruz has been involved in an accreditation process to meet the requirements of FEMA since 2020. I'm not as knowledgeable as you. So what I'm going to do is actually invite you to share from the Coastal Watershed Council's perspective, what is going on with the levee FEMA accreditation process and how does it impact the work that your organization is doing?
Yeah, so since the levees were constructed, it's always been important to maintain them to a certain standard. And the levees are such an important tool that we have as a community to keep us safe from flooding. Looking over the past few weeks, our community has really been reminded of that, of how important this structure is to make sure that our downtown doesn't flood, our riverside communities don't flood. So in order to ensure that the levees do their job, these maintenance requirements are so important. And they've always been there, really regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers, who initially built the levees following the Christmas flood of 1955. So the Army Corps has these regulations that demonstrate, this is what you need to do to maintain the quality of the levee over time. And for many years, the Army Corps itself was the one signing off on this accreditation process, saying that we believe that the levees as they currently are meet these guidelines. What's different now is the Army Corps has handed off much of the management of the levees to the city of Santa Cruz itself. So in that handoff, one of the pieces that the city is now responsible for is this accreditation process, hiring an engineering firm and having the certification done by FEMA in order to say, yes, we're maintaining the levees in such a way to meet this standard. The standard being that the levees are safe, they're functional, and they're going to do their job when a storm comes, which is so important. So as we have this new accreditor using the same guidelines that the Army Corps had always used, that this new firm is reading them just a bit more strictly, a bit differently, and just looking at things through new eyes, they're recommending some changes. And so these changes are what public works staff has put forward and put forward a project to have a contractor come in and help maintain vegetation on what they call the outboard side of the levee. So this is the street side as you're driving past the levee and you're looking at that slope there. That's the outboard side of the levee. You might also hear the term inboard side of the levee. That's from the water's edge up to that paved path. So the majority of the project that we're talking about here is on the outboard side of the levee, the street side.
In case you've just tuned in, this is KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm Christine Barrington for Talk of the Bay, and my guest is Lori Egan, Executive Director of the Coastal Watershed Council, and we are discussing the scope of work related to FEMA accreditation requirements for the San Lorenzo River Levee and the potential concerns that environmental workers have related to how much habitat could be affected by how the work is to be done.
The work that needs to be done is to trim back vegetation, to make it so that an inspector can visually see if there is any seepage or any, inkling of the levee potentially failing, looking for water coming through, that kind of thing. And they need to visually see that when the water is high during a storm like we just had, again, to really make sure that that levee is safe and doing its job. So as the new reading of the rules has come down the pike, one of the things that we're working to do is really find this win-win solution. We know the vegetation needs to be trimmed back so we can have better visibility, but we don't believe it needs to be completely gone. And to be fair, the city has never said it needs to be completely gone, but there's been concern that more of it would be cleared than necessary. So what the Coastal Watershed Council is working to do is to really find this win-win solution. It is so important that we get this accreditation, and it is so important that we maintain habitat, all the habitat that we can. So we're working to increase the community awareness and education around that. Also worked closely with city staff before this item went to city council to improve and bolster some of those environmental protections in this project.
And so just to recap, you did a great job of visualizing for people what's at stake, which is this outboard side of the levee. And we went to a meeting on the levee on a day where it was pouring rain, and there were about 20 people that showed up, 5 of whom were from the city, and I think 3 or 4 from the Coastal Watershed Council. There's a lot of concern and a lot of respect and care for the concern of the community. And what the city employees were communicating is engineers have to be able to see with their eyeballs if water is seeping out of the levee, because that could indicate a possible undermining of the levee, which means that a lot of ground cover plants, they'll just have to be removed because you can't see underneath those ground cover plants. And those plants are very important habitats, right, for certain critters. So that's one of the concerns. What are the other concerns that you have, if you haven't named them all in your previous statement?
Yeah, I mean, the main concern really is that loss of habitat piece, and understanding that, yes, some of these plants need to be removed. Many others can be trimmed. And one of the concerns here is really, and it's in credit to city staff. I mean, city staff are often asked to work wonders with very few resources.
Yes.
And they do an incredible job of this and are often underthanked for it. So we really have a lot of gratitude for the city staff in this. And in this project, this is a huge scope of work. This is 2.5 miles of levee on both sides, the east and the west levee banks. Mm-hmm. And a huge amount of vegetation to tackle in that time, because we have this July 1 timeline to have this accreditation done, and the engineers need to review everything before that July 1 timeline and all these different pieces. So
right. So the vegetation removal has to happen well before that July date.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So huge project scope, a very short timeline. And one of the concerns that we have is that in the haste to meet these goals, we'll remove more than we need to. So that is why we advocated to increase some of the environmental qualifications of the contractor that they do hire for this project, so that there's somebody who's already educated around some of these different concerns doing the work itself, and to increase some of the project oversight from city staff, really, again, sort of making sure that we have a trained crew out there. And the city has agreed to have the contractor use only hand tools, which will allow for a more controlled removal of plants that do need to be removed. Again, that concern being just with this immense amount of work in such a short period of time, are we going to remove more than we need to? And that's actually where we see our organization playing a role, because we regularly engage volunteers. We have volunteer crews out there multiple times a week. And we have this opportunity to really help and to really lend a hand and to demonstrate not only, what an ideal pruning could look like in partnership with city staff and with their input, but also showing the contractor those pieces and to help maintain it over time. So that's the other piece of this, is we need to meet this accreditation by July 1, but we need to continue to meet that accreditation for all the years to come. And so if we do just a small amount of pruning this year, the concern is that, okay, well then when that grows back next year, how much money do we need to spend? But by being able to engage volunteers in this work and on an ongoing basis, we can really help maintain that quality to the accreditation standard while maintaining as much quality habitat as we can.
Well, and with that statement, you're really answering the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, what can we do? How can citizens help? I have in my mind how the indigenous people of this region saw it as their responsibility to care for the earth. And just speaking for myself, I have the sense that if we lend a hand and take on a bit of that vision, we can really help bring the river back to life. So how can people help? Is there anything you want to add to what you've said?
Yes, I would absolutely invite all of the listeners to come out and volunteer with the Coastal Watershed Council. We have a public event every second Saturday of the month, and we call these events River Health Days, really reminding ourselves of why we are doing this work to really have this healthy river and healthy community. And the work involves some of this pruning work that we're talking about to help our levees meet this accreditation standard. But we also have the opportunity to increase the biodiversity out on the river. And in the sites where we've been working, the engineers have already signed off on those, saying that, everything looks good to go. And we can keep adding new plants to these sites that we are working on. So it's all in balance, and our volunteer crews are essential to helping us achieve this vision that we're talking about for this thriving urban riverfront. So our events are always posted on our website at coastal-watershed.org/events. And we also encourage folks that can't, maybe you don't have the time to make it out, but you want to still get involved and give back. We encourage people to give a financial donation if they can. Any amount makes a big difference for our work. And on our website, you can also make a gift at coastal-watershed.org/donate.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me on Talk of the Bay. I find this very inspiring. I think Santa Cruz has an incredible future ahead of itself because of all the amazing citizens that are rolling up their sleeves, people like you who work professionally and those like me who just volunteer. So thank you so much, Lori.
Thank you.
This is Christine Barrington with Talk of the Bay on KSQD Santa Cruz. We'll be back with more about the inspiring work of citizen stewards and environmental advocates who are creating a vibrant interface between the San Lorenzo River, its habitat, and the people who interact with its ecosystem.
Hi, I'm Bobby Bishop, host of Be in the Night, bring you the best I can with jazz, love songs, and soul. Join me on Tuesday evenings from 7 to 10 p.m., playing the classics straight ahead and introducing you to the latest artists and composers. That's Tuesday nights from 7 to 10 p.m. right here on listener-supported KSQD 90.7 FM, Santa Cruz.
Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington, and we are exploring the power of citizens to impact city policy with an eye towards protecting sensitive ecosystems along the San Lorenzo River. A FEMA levee accreditation process is in motion that could impact years of restoration work, and my next guests are citizen stewards with a great love of the river and intimate knowledge of its rhythms. Jane Mio heads the Estuary Project, which conducts regular workdays powered by citizen volunteers to plant and tend native vegetation along the river. And Barbara Riverwoman, a community organizer with a great passion for the life systems native to this precious waterway. Jane, Barbara, thank you so much for joining me on Talk of the Bay. It's a pleasure to have you here in the studio.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, Jane, you are the leader and organizer of the Estuary Project. Could you please introduce yourself and what the Estuary Project is about?
Okay, the Estuary Project is the Valley Women's Club, a native rehab program. And the Estuary Project goes from Laurel Street to the river mouth. And we have been focusing with revegetation mainly on the east side of the levee. And so I have been director since 1916 when we got permitted by Public Works and the Park and Rec Department. And we had kicked off our project in February 2017 with an AmeriCorps team. And we have been working with a wide array of groups, AmeriCorps. We work with the downtown street team, community members, high schools, you name it. we have worked, together on enhancing the vegetation habitat.
So you mean you get together, you bring plants down, you plant them, you probably pull weeds. Like, what is it that, when you say you work on the river, what is it that you're doing?
We have focused in the beginning on re-rescuing the plants that had been put in, after the vegetation program had been authorized by the Corps of Engineers. And they had been surviving, but they hadn't really gotten any care. So what we did is we gave them room, we pruned them so that they could reflourish, and they came back just beautifully. And then I picked certain sites that were really visual for the community and the tourists, because over the years, the decades that I have been engaged with the river, I noticed that the focal points where people stand at the signals and look at the river and, parts, they didn't look very inviting. So I chose the spots that would give a different image to the river. And we have done some really incredible work. We have put over, I think it's in the thousands, plants, and we got donation from Elkhorn Slough Nursery, which no longer exists. We have gotten other donations, but mainly it is thanks to the Tax E, which designates park plants. When people pay their taxes or they buy a house, a certain amount goes to the Park and Rec for that.
Beautiful. So that's how we get our budget to do the work that you do. Mm-hmm. And the estuary project is fully permitted. So you work with the city pretty closely, right? Well,
I work with the Park and Rec department, and I have to say the staff, I call them my elves, mm-hmm. That works on the levee, they are so supportive of what we do, and they're so willing to help here and there, whatever we need, and it is just wonderful.
Well, I'm hearing, as I'm investigating the story, a lot of collaboration tales of the people who see the river, love the river, care about it. There is a close collaborative process, and they're trying to work with the city and work with citizens and work with each other to care for the river. And I'm loving hearing this, because I think if more of us care for the river, this amazing heartstring of this county is going to come into greater connection with us.
Well, the one part is too that I just love and adore is some of the volunteers do it a one time, or just for one time, but then they send somebody else. Somebody comes, quite a bit, is repeat volunteer for the Saturdays. It's every third Saturday, from 9 to 11. And somebody will say, I'm really good with photography. Do you want me to come and take pictures? Or, do you need some help with website? Do you need some help with this? Or I know somebody that has extra plants, extra tools. It's just, it's like a dance, because it's like nature. Everything is interwoven. Everybody is needed. Everybody has something to add, to give. And so many times people think, it's just one thing that they need that makes this whole big picture. But there's so many components to it.
I love it. You're describing the social ecosystem marrying the natural ecosystem, and that's beautiful. In case you have just tuned in, you are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz. This is Talk of the Bay, and I am Christine Barrington. We are talking about the potential impacts of a massive cleanup process set to take place along the outer banks of the San Lorenzo River for FEMA accreditation. Jade Mio of the Estuary Project and community organizer Barbara Riverwoman are my guests. I want to pivot to you, Barbara. Your name is Barbara Riverwoman, and that name sort of says it all. Can you share with our listeners who you are and what your relationship is to the river?
Well, I moved close to the river. I've been living near the river 25 years now, right next to the levee. And I actually I've been a birder for practically all my life, but I didn't really understand the richness of the river until it was threatened. And Jane was one of the first people who sort of alerted me to the threat to the river because they were going to introduce a pilot paddling project, bringing kayaks and paddle boards and things onto the river. And so with Jane and some other people who were really caring about the river, we went to the city council and expressed our concerns, and there was a group formed that included Jane, and then they brought a recommendation back to to make a long story short, actually that paddling project ended and it wasn't allowed to go forward. So we protected the river, and during that process I became very not only interested but infatuated with the birds on the river. And then Jane and I decided to do this river blog, and every other week one of us would write something about some bird or a group of birds that we saw. And both of us really loved to watch the behavior of birds, not just identifying the birds, but sort of connecting with birds. And I had one of almost a mystical experience in connection with one species called a pied-billed grebe, which lives on the river, but it's pretty much unknown and unnoticed by a lot of people. It's a very inconspicuous bird. So anyway, that was my experience of connecting with the birds on the river. And we wrote that blog, and it's still available online, even though it's not active right now.
Well, I'll make sure to include a link to that blog in the show notes.
Please do.
We do a blog for every show, and we'll include that. And the two of you were telling me before we started this interview that there is an incredibly rich number of birds on the San Lorenzo River. Could you speak to that for just a minute? Either one of you or both of you at the same time? A duet? It's like bird song.
Well, it's kind of, I'll talk about that just briefly, because there was a great saint of birding in our town named Steve Giroux. And I really wanted a list of all the birds that he had seen on the river, because he was the best. He was sort of the center of the birding community at that time. He said, I've been meaning to put together this list. I'll do it. This is the nudge I need. So he put together a list of the 122 birds that Jane mentioned.
Great. So over 120 different species of birds, which is extraordinarily rich.
Right.
And so this is just a little bit of context for both of yours deep love and passion for the San Lorenzo River. Now let's get to why I invited you into the studio. What do you see related to this FEMA accreditation process? What do you see as your biggest concerns or opportunities this moment? I think we're going to start with the concerns. Yeah?
Well, one of the things, it's almost like a really neat circle for what you said earlier. The interweaving, the collaboration, co-working, how that is a good format. And unfortunately, the way it worked, that didn't happen.
So what you're saying is this nice collaboration between the city and environmental organizations and stuff didn't happen around this accreditation process and this removal of vegetation and rodent control that's going to have to happen. So what you're saying is you didn't observe that kind of close collaboration in this case. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And I have worked in different functions with the city, and I know that some really good results happen when that takes place.
Yes.
That, collaboration, inclusiveness, and because actually that is what happened, way back, that created the SLURP, which is the San Lorenzo Urban River Plan. Because of that collaboration we had with the Corps of Engineers, the vegetation was allowed to be.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is there was this period of time where the Army Corps of Engineers was working with the city around the levee. And then in 2020, the Army Corps of Engineers turned the care of the levee over to the city. And then FEMA came in and said, well, you've got to meet certification requirements, correct? And that's where a lot of things got put into play. And this vegetation and rodent control is sort of the last piece, and it's in this really intense time crunch.
The other thing that I do want to say in order to make a point in regards to collaboration, ever since the beginning of December when we found out that this was taking place, and we kind of went, well, let's talk. Let's see if we can do moderation from the extreme to something that we all can live with, that satisfies all and everybody's needs. There have been adjustments, which is an indicator for me that even more with more time could have happened.
Right.
So
that time crunch is very critical. And so, Barbara, I want to pivot to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that this is a whole new ball game. I mean, this is very different than what we've been dealing with in the past. When Jane and I got involved in protecting vegetation on the river in 2015, or at least that's when I got involved, it was all about concern about flooding and overtopping the levee. And they didn't want log jams. They didn't want in any way vegetation to impede the process of conveying the water down the channel. That's totally understandable. I live right next to the river. I'm very vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So I understand it from that perspective, too. The December 13th City Council meeting was a shock to me, and I wouldn't have known about it except that Jane alerted me to it. Mm-hmm. And I alerted a bunch of other people, and there were quite a few letters written in. There was nobody in the City Council chamber on that day except Jane, Lori, Kaya, and me. So the four of us were invited to the meeting on the levee, but then Katie Stewart invited anybody who was interested. So then, in that sense, I was a community organizer. I reached out to about 16 of my friends and invited them to come to that meeting because I wanted more overview from the community and more eyes on what was going on in the river. Because
right. And most of those people seemed to show up because there was about 20 people there in the pouring rain. I was quite impressed.
It was very dramatic. It was one of the more interesting meetings I've ever had with the city.
Yeah.
I think we bonded in the rain there. That was very fun.
What I'm hearing as I've been exploring the story is there is strong encouragement for the city to choose a contractor that has some sensitivity to the issue. And if that happens and there's collaboration with the Estuary Project and the CWC, then we might be able to achieve this massive 2.2 miles of work done in such a way that it could preserve some of the important work that
Yeah, and it's so ironic because, working for 6 years, the success is pretty high. Mm-hmm. How well it has taken and all that. It's almost like a punishment of the plants doing so well with care. So the demonstration spots that I'm putting together with volunteers is to say, okay, we bite the bullet, and we trim it in a certain way that will give you visibility when you drive on top of the levee as well as when you drive along the street to see if you have seepage. And if that works, then let's use that visual pattern for the rest of the outboard.
Right. So that's what I'm hearing is the hopeful plan that your group and CWC and citizen groups hope to effect is to do a demonstration of we can sensitively trim this up, and hopefully this contractor could take the lead and replicate that. I heard Katie Stewart at the meeting say that the city wanted to be surgical. They were going to use hand tools and be surgical about what they did. And if that can actually happen, that would be good.
I just want to give credit to Jane and the Coastal Watershed Council, because the original Addenda A of the agenda item that was approved by the city, would have been approved by the City Council, was changed, and they added the because of Jane and Lori, they added the hand tools and the hand trimming.
That's fabulous.
Our experience working for years, and then Bruce Van Allen working for more years than that, or way back, is that unless the community pushes back and protects, because environmental or habitat value of the environment is not part of what the Public Works or even Parks and Recreation normally thinks about.
Right.
That's not their job description. That's not their. That's not their. I mean, they're scared because their job is to from flooding. I understand, but
Right.
it's going to take community organizing and action and that's a good example of the community stepping forward and saying, look.
That gives us the wind under our wings then to interface with our government, which is, representing a modern civilization with all its benefits and its drawbacks, and they're under a lot of pressure. And, there's a saying that, politicians don't create political will.
Right.
People do.
Right.
So that's what community action does. And so I just want to thank you, both of you, and all the others that you've named for standing up for this community.
I just wanted to say that actually I always look and see how other communities, countries, etc., do certain things when we have an issue. And in my exploration, I have actually found that so many great projects happened because there was somebody on city staff that went, yeah, let's try that. Let's go with that vision. And really then started spreading their net out together with the community spreading their net out. And then from that, some incredible, beautiful things have happened. So it is that marriage. And it is possible.
It is possible. And all the people who are advocating for the river, they make this possible. And so, as we wrap up, if people want to get involved and they want to connect with your work and support it, how do they find you and when are your work days? I think you said every third Saturday from 9
to 11.
to 11.
Yeah.
So if people want to look this information up, where would they go?
The Estuary Project is linked Santa Cruz County Volunteer Center.
The Santa Cruz County Volunteer Center.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I will try to make this extra clear in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me on Talk of the Bay. I want to thank Bruce Van Allen, Lori Egan, Jane Mio, and Barbara Riverwoman for sharing the history and vision of river stewardship along the San Lorenzo. If you would like to learn more or join the efforts of the Coastal Watershed Council or the Estuary Project, visit ksqd.org for extensive show notes and contact information. There is a constant call for volunteers who seek to support the health and vitality of this rich but struggling river system. And there is a post-storm cleanup day scheduled for January 28th. It is sponsored by many important local environmental organizations and is intended to remove plastics that have washed into this sensitive environment. Consult our show notes or the City of Santa Cruz for more information. I'm Christine Barrington for Talk of the Bay on KSQD Santa Cruz, your community radio station for the Central Coast.